December 18, 1944. Snow-covered Belgium. A German Hauptmann kneels in an abandoned American foxhole, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. In his trembling hands, not from cold but from confusion, he holds a copy of the Stars and Stripes newspaper. The date reads December 15th, 3 days ago. But that's impossible. His unit overran this position yesterday. The Americans fled so quickly, they left coffee still steaming in their canteens. Yet here, buried under frozen dirt and spent shell casings, is a newspaper from the future. Or is it? Welcome to one of World War II's most brilliantly executed intelligence operations. A deception so subtle, so perfectly orchestrated, that German commanders would spend weeks trying to understand what they were seeing. And by the time they figured it out, the battle was already lost. This is the story of Operation Newspaper, the psychological warfare campaign that weaponized information itself. The Ardennes Forest, winter 1944. The German Wehrmacht was preparing its last great gamble, a massive offensive through the wooded hills of Belgium and Luxembourg, aiming to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. They called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. History would know it as the Battle of the Bulge. German intelligence was meticulous. For months, they'd gathered information on American positions, unit strengths, and defensive preparations. They knew which divisions were green, which were exhausted from previous battles, which sectors were thinly held. What they didn't know was that the Americans knew they were coming. The rules of warfare in 1944 were well established. Intelligence flowed upward from field observations. Reconnaissance patrols probed enemy lines. Radio intercepts provided glimpses into enemy planning. Captured documents offered precious insights. Both sides played this game expertly. But the Americans were about to break every rule in the intelligence playbook. Lieutenant Colonel James Polk sat in his cramped office at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, or SHAF, staring at a problem that kept him awake at night. A West Point graduate with a degree in psychology, Polk had been pulled from combat operations to join a newly formed psychological warfare unit. His assignment: find ways to confuse, demoralize, and deceive the German military without firing a single shot. The challenge was unique. Traditional deception operations, fake tank formations, dummy landing craft, radio traffic from non-existent units, worked on a strategic level. They could make the enemy think an attack was coming from a different direction, or that your army was larger than it actually was. But Polk wanted something more insidious, something that would burrow into the minds of German officers and make them question their own observations. Something that would make them doubt their intelligence apparatus, their chain of command, even their own eyes. He found his answer in the most mundane of objects: newspapers. The Stars and Stripes was the official newspaper of the United States Armed Forces. Published multiple times per week, it carried news from home, sports scores, comic strips, and crucially, unit citations, casualty reports, and sanitized information about military operations. Every American soldier looked forward to getting a copy. It was a connection to normalcy in the chaos of war. Polk realized that newspapers weren't just morale boosters. They were intelligence documents. A German officer who captured a Stars and Stripes could learn which units were in which sectors, what supplies were arriving, which commanders had been promoted. The newspaper was a window into American military operations. But what if that window showed a carefully curated view? What if the Germans were reading exactly what the Americans wanted them to read? What if the date on that window was wrong? The concept was beautifully simple. Create special editions of Stars and Stripes with future dates. Fill them with false information. Phantom units moving to phantom locations, supply convoys that didn't exist, casualty reports from battles that hadn't happened yet. Then deliberately leave these papers where German patrols would find them. The brilliance lay in the dating. A newspaper from 3 days in the future would create an impossible paradox in German intelligence analysis. If captured on December 15th, how could it be dated December 18th? There were only 3 possibilities, and all of them were catastrophic for German planning. 1. The Americans had broken German codes and knew exactly when and where attacks would occur, allowing them to pre-position newspapers knowing those positions would be overrun on specific dates. 2. American logistics and information distribution were so superior, they could print and distribute newspapers across the entire front line with seemingly impossible speed, suggesting an organizational capability far beyond German estimates. 3. The dates were intentional misdirection, which meant every piece of information in the newspaper was suspect, rendering all captured intelligence potentially worthless. Any way German intelligence analyzed it, the dated newspapers created doubt, and doubt in military planning is poison. Polk assembled a team of 8 specialists, 3 intelligence analysts, 2 German-speaking interrogators, 2 printing press operators, and 1 journalist who'd worked for the Associated Press before the war. They worked in a requisitioned printing facility in Reims, France, under security protocols usually reserved for atomic research. The operation had to be absolutely secret. If word leaked, even to other Allied units, that some newspapers were fake, it would destroy confidence in all Stars and Stripes publications. Soldiers needed to trust their newspaper. This meant the fake editions had to be physically identical to real ones. Same paper stock, same typeface, same printing press artifacts, even the same coffee stains and finger smudges that came from being handled by multiple readers. They created elaborate false narratives. The 106th Infantry Division, actually a green unit just arrived from England, became battle-hardened veterans in the false newspapers, complete with fabricated combat citations. The 2nd Armored Division was reported moving to a sector where no tanks existed. Supply columns carrying winter equipment were described arriving in areas where Americans had no intention of defending. But the real genius was in the small details. Sports scores were consistent across editions. You couldn't have the Yankees winning on December 15th in one paper and losing on December 18th in another. Comic strips had to progress logically. Casualty reports had to match previous publications. Even the classified ads section, where soldiers sold watches and traded stamps, had to maintain internal consistency. The team created a fictional timeline. In their alternate December 1944, the Americans were stronger, better supplied, and positioned differently than they actually were. They wove this fiction across dozens of pages, across multiple editions, creating a self-reinforcing narrative that would hold up under German intelligence scrutiny. The distribution method was equally clever. Real newspapers went to frontline units as normal. But certain positions, ones intelligence suggested were likely to be overrun or probed by German patrols, received the special editions. The soldiers in those positions never knew they had fake newspapers. They read them, used them to wrap rations, left them in foxholes and command posts, exactly as they would with real ones. Supply sergeants were told only that certain newspaper bundles were marked with subtle ink stamps and had to go to specific coordinates. The stamps were invisible under normal light, but glowed under ultraviolet, a precaution to ensure the fake papers could be identified and recovered if the operation was compromised. The first test came on December 10, 1944. A German reconnaissance patrol captured an American forward observation post near Losheim Gap. In the confusion of the brief firefight, the Americans withdrew, leaving behind equipment, rations, and several newspapers dated December 13th. 3 days in the future. The German patrol leader, Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, initially thought it was a printing error. He mentioned it in his after-action report, but assigned it little importance. The newspapers went into the intelligence analysis pipeline. 2 days later, another patrol captured papers dated December 14th, then December 15th. Each time, the dates were impossible, 2 or 3 days ahead of the capture date. By December 14th, German intelligence officers were comparing the newspapers. They laid them out chronologically and began analyzing content. What they saw troubled them deeply. The December 13th paper mentioned the 99th Infantry Division reinforcing positions near Monschau, a critical sector for the planned German offensive. The December 15th paper reported the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, moving to reserve positions behind the Elsenborn Ridge, exactly where German planners expected to achieve breakthrough. Were the Americans repositioning forces? Did they know about the offensive? How could they print newspapers about troop movements that hadn't happened yet? German intelligence sent urgent requests to frontline units. Capture more American newspapers. Verify the dates, verify the information. Compare it against aerial reconnaissance and radio intercepts. The Wehrmacht's intelligence service, the Abwehr, assigned a full analysis team to what they codenamed the Zeitungsrätsel, the newspaper puzzle. They brought in cryptographers, thinking the dates might be coded messages. They consulted with printing experts to determine if the papers were authentic. They even questioned captured American soldiers about newspaper distribution procedures. Every analysis confirmed the papers were genuine Stars and Stripes publications. The paper stock matched. The printing quality was consistent. The content referenced real events, real people, real units. Captured American soldiers confirmed receiving newspapers regularly and found nothing unusual about the editions they were shown. But the dates remained impossible. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, received the intelligence reports on December 15th. He was a day away from launching his portion of the Ardennes offensive. His forces were in position, his attack routes planned, his objectives clear. And now his intelligence officers were telling him the Americans somehow had newspapers from the future. Von Manteuffel was a practical man, a soldier who trusted observable facts over speculation. He read through the captured newspapers himself, noting the impossible dates, the detailed unit information, the almost casual mention of defensive preparations in exactly the sectors he planned to attack. He called his intelligence chief, Major Klaus Becker, into his command post. Outside, thousands of German soldiers huddled in frozen forests, waiting for dawn and the order to attack. "Explain this to me," von Manteuffel said, pointing to the newspapers spread across his map table. Becker had been awake for 36 hours trying to solve the puzzle. "Herr General, there are only 3 explanations. 1. It's a printing error, and the dates mean nothing. 2. American logistics are far more efficient than we estimated, and they can print and distribute newspapers across a front of hundreds of kilometers in less than a day. 3. They know we're coming, and they've pre-positioned these newspapers specifically for us to capture." Von Manteuffel studied the papers in silence. "Which do you believe?" "I don't know, sir. But I know this. Either the Americans are incompetent and can't even date their newspapers correctly, or they're brilliant and playing a game we don't understand. I don't think they're incompetent." The general nodded slowly. "Neither do I." This was the moment Polk's operation achieved its purpose. Not to completely stop the German offensive, that was impossible, but to plant a seed of doubt in German commanders' minds, to make them question their intelligence, to make them wonder if their meticulously planned surprise attack was actually a surprise at all. Von Manteuffel couldn't cancel the offensive. Orders came from Hitler himself. But he could adjust his approach. He could hold back reserves. He could probe more carefully instead of charging forward with complete confidence. And that hesitation, that doubt, would cost the Germans precious time in an operation where speed was everything. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. The German offensive began with a massive artillery barrage that shook the frozen earth. Thousands of shells screamed through the pre-dawn darkness, targeting American positions across an 85-mile front. But in several sectors, American defenders were more prepared than German intelligence had predicted. Not because the fake newspapers had revealed real German plans. They hadn't. But because the newspapers had made German commanders cautious. And that caution slowed their initial advance just enough for American reserves to respond. The psychological effect rippled through German ranks in unexpected ways. When patrols overran American positions and found more newspapers, these ones with current dates, officers spent valuable time examining them, comparing them to the future editions, looking for discrepancies and hidden meanings. German intelligence officers became obsessed with the newspaper puzzle. Resources that should have gone to analyzing actual American defensive positions instead went to studying publication dates, printing techniques, and distribution patterns. An entire intelligence team spent the crucial first week of the offensive trying to decode a mystery that had no solution because it was based on a simple deception: fake dates printed on real-looking newspapers. The Americans, meanwhile, maintained operational security about Operation Newspaper, even as the battle raged. Polk's team continued producing dated editions, creating an ever-expanding alternate timeline that German intelligence tried desperately to map and understand. Some German officers convinced themselves they'd figured it out. The dates must be coded references to other information. December 13th actually meant grid coordinates. The sports scores were troop strength indicators. The comic strips contained hidden maps. They were seeing patterns that didn't exist, finding meaning in randomness, because the human mind cannot accept that something seemingly important might be meaningless. The dated newspapers appeared significant. Therefore, they must be significant. Therefore, they required extensive analysis. This was psychological warfare at its most elegant. The weapon wasn't the information in the newspapers. It was the fact that German intelligence couldn't stop analyzing them. By December 22nd, the German offensive was stalling. American resistance proved fiercer than expected. The crucial fuel dumps the Germans needed to capture remained in American hands. The weather cleared, allowing Allied air power to devastate German columns. And German commanders remained cautious, holding back reserves, second-guessing their intelligence, remembering those impossible newspapers. The Battle of the Bulge would rage until late January 1945. The Germans would penetrate up to 50 miles into Allied lines before being pushed back. It would become the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States Army, with nearly 90,000 American casualties. But historians who studied German planning documents after the war found something curious. German commanders consistently described being uncertain about American positions and strength, despite having conducted extensive reconnaissance. They mentioned supply problems they'd failed to anticipate, defensive positions they didn't expect to encounter, and a general sense that their intelligence might be compromised. Some of this was typical fog of war. Some was excellent American operational security. But buried in German intelligence reports were repeated references to captured American newspapers with inconsistent dates and questionable information. Operation Newspaper was never publicly acknowledged during the war. The Stars and Stripes continued publication for decades, building trust with generations of American service members. That trust couldn't be compromised by revealing that some editions had been fabricated. Polk's team destroyed all physical evidence of the operation. The special printing plates were melted down, The false editions were collected and burned. Even most of the operational records were classified and eventually destroyed. Only a brief mention appears in certain intelligence community histories, and even that doesn't explain the full scope or methodology. The 8 specialists who ran the operation were dispersed to different assignments. They were told never to discuss their work, even with other intelligence personnel. Some went to their graves without telling their families what they'd done in that printing facility in Reims. The German officers who obsessed over the newspaper puzzle never learned they'd been chasing a phantom. After the war, captured intelligence documents showing their extensive analysis of the dated newspapers were quietly buried in archives, seen by only a handful of historians. Lieutenant Colonel James Polk returned to teaching after the war, accepting a position at a small college in Vermont. He taught psychology and occasionally military history. Students found him engaging but oddly reticent about his own war service. When pressed, he'd say he worked in information analysis and change the subject. He died in 1983, having never spoken publicly about Operation Newspaper. But among intelligence professionals, a legend persisted. They called it the newspaper trick or the date game, passing the story between generations with the caveat that it might be apocryphal. The details were too elegant, too perfectly executed to be entirely believable. Except it was real. Every impossible date, every agonized hour German intelligence spent trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. Every moment of doubt planted in commanders' minds during the critical opening days of Germany's last major offensive. The brilliance of Operation Newspaper wasn't in the deception itself. It was in understanding how the enemy would respond to that deception. Polk didn't need to convince German intelligence that the false information was true. He just needed to make them uncertain about what was true. In warfare, uncertainty is often more valuable than misinformation. Think about the German Hauptmann kneeling in that frozen foxhole, holding a newspaper from 3 days in the future. He doesn't know what it means. He doesn't know if it means anything. But he can't ignore it. He has to report it. And once reported, it has to be analyzed. And once analyzed, it generates questions that have no answers. That newspaper, with its impossible date, became a tiny grain of sand in the machinery of German intelligence. One grain might not matter, but Operation Newspaper scattered thousands of those grains across the entire intelligence apparatus. And over time, even the most efficient machinery will grind to a halt. The lesson extends far beyond World War II. In any conflict, military, political, corporate, information is weapon. But the most powerful weapon isn't false information. It's information that makes your opponent doubt everything else they know. When you can make your enemy question their own observations, their own intelligence apparatus, their own timeline of events, you've won a victory that doesn't appear on any map and doesn't generate any casualties. But it's a victory nonetheless. Those German officers who spent December 1944 trying to understand how American newspapers could be dated 3 days in the future never realized they'd been defeated not by superior firepower or better tactics, but by a simple deception that exploited the one thing every intelligence service depends on: the belief that information can be understood, analyzed, and used to predict the future. Sometimes the best way to predict the future is to print it in a newspaper 3 days early and let your enemy find it.